Hello, welcome to Global Online Academy's Flex course, The U.S. and the World, and the live session on defense and security with Alex Nicoll. My name is Nelson Graves, and I'm the founder of News Decoder, and I'm speaking to you from Paris, France. And I'm joined on camera by our speaker, Alex Nicoll. Hello, Alex, in London.
Hi.
Also on camera are students and faculty at the Greenhill School in Addison, Texas, outside Dallas. Hello, Greenhill.
Hello.
Good morning. And with us from Global Online Academy is Jason Cummings.
Hello.
Jason masterminded, or is masterminding this course, and is with us from Massachusetts. Hello, Jason, and thanks very much for the course.
Thank you, Nelson.
This is the first of 4 live sessions on major international themes. There are close to 400 students enrolled in this course, and the terrain to cover is vast indeed. It's more than a bit intimidating. I've had a peek at some of the discussions underway on this week's topic of defense and security, and I'm impressed by the range of issues being discussed and the quality of the conversation. We want these live sessions to be as interactive as possible, so I encourage the students and faculty at Greenhill to chime in at any point. And those of you who are connecting remotely, you can use the chat room to ask a question or make a comment at any time. I will be monitoring the chat. We want lots of questions. Now on to our speaker. Alexander Nicoll is a writer on defense and European issues based in London. From 2003 until 2015, he was on the staff of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, where he was editor of the think tank's Annual Review of International Affairs. Previously, he spent 18 years as a reporter and editor at the Financial Times, including as defense correspondent from 1997 until 2002. He began his career at Reuters as a correspondent in Hong Kong, Paris, Tehran, and New York. So Alex has been around the world, and he's seen changes in defense and security over the years from close up. It's a pleasure to have Alex with us today, and I look forward to hearing his views. Alex will speak for a few minutes, and then we'll move into Q&A. Alex, over to you.
Well, Nelson, thank you very much indeed. It's really a delight to be with you all today, and thanks to Jason and also to Scott. Thanks very much indeed. It's really great. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. And I'm going to be talking, first of all, about threats to the well-being of America. Of course, there are lots of those, and we can think of things like disease, financial disasters, climate change. But what I'm going to be talking about specifically is threats that involve violence, threats that could involve the US military, US intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies, war, that kind of thing. So I thought that what I'd do is, first of all, just give you my kind of top 5 threats to the United States, the things that should be on the agenda of the new president. And then I'm going to put them into context a little. And then finally, I'm going to look briefly at how the presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, are looking at those. And I'm going to make some, you might think quite sweeping statements, which I hope will provoke discussion. And I just want to say right now that I don't support any political party, and I do not have a vote in the United States. So let me just talk about the top 5 threats as I see them. First of all, nuclear weapons. They have been the biggest threat since the Second World War, and there's been a lot of progress on reducing the numbers of weapons and also the number of countries that have them, but they're still a serious concern, and there are still countries that want to have them that don't have them now. So that's the top one, nuclear weapons. Second one, the turmoil in the Middle East. Of course, that has been a huge problem for decades. It's not a new thing. The situation is not really getting any better. And we have multiple conflicts in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen. The US still has a vital interest in having a stable Middle East, It has commitments to allies and friends, but solutions to the problems in the Middle East are very hard to reach. Third one, Russian aggression. I can see there's been some discussion about this already in the sort of online chats, and some good comments. And one could call Russian aggression Russian assertiveness, whatever you exactly call it. It's clear that Russia is still nursing grievances after the end of the Cold War, and that it's desperate to sort of reassert itself in the world, and that poses dangers. Okay, so that's the first three: nuclear weapons, Middle East turmoil, Russian aggression. The fourth one that I'm going to talk about is violent extremism or terrorism. Of course, following the terrible shock of the 9/11 attacks, the US has been on a mission against terrorism. It's a huge challenge. Terrorism is something that all governments need to pay serious attention to. But the threat to national security, I think, can sometimes be exaggerated. In any case, solutions to terrorism are difficult. So those are my top 4 international threats. I'm going to add a fifth one, perhaps a little controversially. I'm going to say that the fifth top threat to the United States is actually gun violence within the United States. Now, it's a domestic problem. It's a domestic political issue. But if you were to have the same number of deaths from guns in another country, then the US and other countries would be viewing that as an international problem, not a domestic problem, because the level of deaths from guns in the United States is higher than in any current armed conflict in the world, except Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. But let's talk mainly about international threats today. If you consider the presidencies of Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, that's the last 36 years, you'll find that they have all spent a very great deal of their time on the top 4 of my 5 threats. So they're really not new things. And we've had all sorts of things happening in that time. We've had the end of the Cold War, war in the Balkans, the 9/11 attacks, the Afghan war, the Iraq war, revolutions in the Middle East, war in Syria, and finally the growth of ISIS, or Islamic State, or whatever you want to call it. There's another thing which links all these things, and that is that the United States has played a pivotal role in all of them. It's been the principal guardian of global security. Now, why does it do this, you might ask? Well, it's not out of the goodness of its heart. It's not just to be generous. It does it because dealing with global threats makes the United States itself and its allies safer. Now, you'll always hear a lot during election campaigns, and this one is no exception, about how the world has become more dangerous, that the United States has become weaker, and so on. And I'm going to tell you that we need to treat all statements like that with a large pinch of salt. In fact, the world is a whole lot less dangerous than at some recent times in history, such as during the Cold War. There are always dangers, and any US president deals with them every day. But we have to remember that no president carries a magic wand that can solve problems instantly. The world is complicated. And we also have to remember that the US is strong. It's very well prepared and experienced in dealing with threats to its security. It has an excellent military, very large, very well equipped. In fact, the United States spends more money on defense than the next 10 biggest spending countries combined. And the US also has big intelligence agencies. It has huge authority in the world, in diplomacy, that derives partly from its military strength, but also from its economic leadership, the leverage that brings, its technological and scientific leadership, from its network of alliances and friendships around the world. So despite what you may hear, the US is still an extraordinarily influential nation. In international affairs, as in any aspect of life, there are going to be setbacks. There will be some things that go badly and some things where they go better. And presidents have to make difficult decisions. Sometimes they get them wrong. But in actual fact, what I've noticed is that US foreign policy basically stays fundamentally the same, although adapting, shifting sometimes, but it stays fundamentally the same through different administrations of whichever party. And in terms of keeping America safe, basically, that approach has worked. So what are the candidates saying about these national security issues? I'm sure many of you watched the debate the other night. We saw quite a good representation, I thought, of the candidates' views on security issues. We saw Hillary Clinton stressing her experience. She has a lot of experience. She points out the crises that she's been involved in, the successes of which she's been a part. For example, the agreement to limit Iran's nuclear program. Donald Trump, in contrast, of course, has no experience of government whatsoever. But he attacks Clinton and the Democrats for having been involved in what he sees as bad agreements, bad policies. He seems to blame President Obama and Clinton for a mess in the Middle East and even for creating ISIS. I would say that kind of blanket criticism is pretty ridiculous, really. Now, Clinton wants to be seen as having a cool head in a crisis, in contrast to Trump. Of course, we don't know how Trump would react in a crisis, but he does seem to be easily provoked. He takes every criticism very personally. Clinton believes firmly in the alliances that the United States has around the world. She believes the US is stronger in dealing with global threats when it's working with international partners. Trump, in contrast, seems to look at alliances as if they were business deals. He doesn't want America to have to pay all the time for being the world's policeman. And this is actually not a new argument. For example, America is always pressuring Europe to spend more on its own defense. But we have to remember that America has alliances because they help its own defense as well. On ISIS, Clinton has laid out a plan that actually is very similar to what's being done now and is having a fair amount of success. So you could say that she's taking basically a traditional national security approach, one that's built pretty realistically, seeks to go on containing the threats that have endangered the United States for a long time, making use of the advantages that the US has in the world. You could call it an establishment approach, but that also means it's a common sense approach, drawing on experience. Now, Trump, on the other hand, sees things from a different starting point. And that starting point, as I'm sure you're well aware, is immigration. His normal key themes are Mexico and Muslims. He would build a wall all the way along the Mexican border, somehow make Mexico pay for it. Now, I would suggest that that would turn Mexico, a completely friendly country, a neighbor that poses no security threat whatsoever, into an enemy. And it's hard to see how that would be in America's interest. And he would also impose much stricter border controls on all Muslims. He sees a terrorist threat from Muslims coming to the United States. Now, I would say that the US does have to be vigilant on terrorism, but that is not the way to do it. There's always a debate about immigration, but terrorism is a tiny factor in that argument. So just finally, what about the threats that I identified? Nuclear weapons. Well, Trump sees them as the biggest threat. He doesn't want to use them. Well, that's really fantastic. But he suggests that more countries, such as Japan and South Korea, could have them. And that is diametrically opposed to the long-standing American position. The Middle East, well, he blames his opponent for the mess, but he's not really prescribed any solutions. What would he do? On Russia, he's expressed admiration for Putin. On terrorism, it's really hard to know what he'd do differently except have tougher border controls, which again, I would suggest is not a solution. So overall, just as a final comment, having watched the debate, and I'd be interested in your views on this, as a non-American, what struck me watching it was that Trump was painting a very grim and negative picture of the United States. I really don't know why he does that. You know, sure, there are always problems, but we have to remember that if somebody who's lost their family or their home or their livelihood through some war, like in Syria, the United States still is pretty much like paradise. So that's all I'm going to say in these remarks. I'm very happy. We look forward very much to discussing these items, these matters with you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Alex. And we have two questions that have come in already via the chat room. But before we turn to them, I'd like to offer the floor to Greenhill School to find out if there are any questions there from Scott Cotton, the teacher there, or any of his students. Okay, well, while you're mulling your questions, and I know there will be some there, there's always a shiver of nervousness at the beginning of these things. I'll read the first question that came in via chat. It's addressed, Dear Alexander, you state you do not have a political preference or vote in the U.S. election. Alex, if you couldn't detect this from his accent, is a Brit. Hold on, I have to scroll up here. There we go. I was wondering, A, do you have a personal political stance in your own country, in the UK, i.e., what's your view on Brexit and their involvement in NATO? And B, so this is a two-part question. The second part, in your view, how important is the decision that's made in the US regarding the president to the UK? Would you have a preference? So he's actually drawing you into the debate, Alex, on the U.S. election. What are your views on those questions?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for those questions. I don't have a political affiliation in the UK either. I just try to look at things as I see them. I think I voted for all the three main parties in this country in different elections, and I have not voted for the Scottish Nationalists. That's only because I don't have a vote in Scotland. On Brexit, just very briefly, this is going to be a traumatic few years for the United Kingdom because we made this momentous decision to leave the European Union, which we've been part of for a long time, 43 years, I think. 28 countries bound together in a single free trade agreement area, and for some reason we're leaving it to do with, again, rearing its head, and in my view it's not in our interests, but we're going to have to make the best of it now, and see what kind of a deal we can get from our European partners who aren't terribly happy with us right now. I do believe, obviously, that NATO is terribly important. NATO is important to Britain, it's important to the United States, it's especially important to the Eastern European countries that have joined it in more recent years because of the new assertiveness of Russia, as I mentioned. I think that we have to think of NATO as a voluntary agreement to defend each other against any attack. In other words, that is the essence of NATO, that if one country is attacked, all the other countries guarantee to go to its defense. And in fact, the Article 5 of the NATO treaty that stipulates that, the only time it's been invoked, actually, was when America was attacked on 9/11. And then other NATO countries did help America's defense in various ways after that. So I think NATO is terribly important. I think that Hillary Clinton is taking the right approach to it. Trump has questioned NATO. There was a lot of discussion in the chat rooms about whether he would back NATO when it came to a crisis and so forth. I thought that was very interesting. Some people were thinking that in the end he probably would. And, that seems to be a sage suggestion, but of course we don't really know about Donald Trump. He's an unknown quantity. As I mentioned in my remarks, he's not alone in saying that other countries should pay more for their defense, whether he's talking about Japan or South Korea or European countries. That is something we've heard from Washington for a long time, and it's a fair point. And in fact, European countries have been stepping up a bit more in recent years. So it's a message that is getting through. We're all in it together. We're all together in dealing with various global threats around the world. On the final part of that question, of course, what the US does still affects the rest of the world enormously, and I think whoever is elected president, it's very important for Europe and for the whole of the rest of the world. What approaches the president of whichever party, whoever it is, takes towards the rest of the world. So it's still very important.
We have another. Before I go back to Texas, we have two questions, Alex, on trade, actually, which is related to defense and security to a certain extent. We could voice these off on your former colleague, Alan Wheatley, next week.
Yes.
We'll be discussing the international economy, but you're somebody who knows a lot about the international economy, so I'm going to give you a chance to...
Okay, I don't guarantee, but I'll do my best.
So the first one, I'll read it. It says, buckling under pressure from the left during the primaries, Hillary Clinton now opposes the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade deal with East Asian countries. What long-range benefits to the U.S. economy might come from supporting this agreement? Do you have any views on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, Alex?
I'm not sure I have any specific views on the TPP. I do think that trade agreements in general are terribly important. They go beyond the actual terms, trade terms that are agreed in them. They are a very symbolic and important thing for a country to do. For example, we can see it in the European Union. The European Union is much more than just a trade agreement. It's countries basically agreeing that they take very similar views of life in general. And the TPP, I don't know about the terms of negotiations of the TPP. Certainly Alan Wheatley next week will be able to talk about it much more. I think, when you've got a country as important as China growing, it's going to be terribly important for everybody in a trade agreement to feel that their economies are going to be opened up by that agreement, that they're going to be able to grow. So it needs to produce kind of equal opportunities to grow in the future, equal opportunities for jobs and those kinds of things. So that's the kind of consideration that the new president will have to take into account when he or she is looking at that issue.
Scott, any questions from Texas?
Yeah.
Yeah. My question was,
Speak up. Yeah.
is what you think the United States do as far as the issue of Syrian immigrants and other immigrants coming into our country, and whether we should allow them into our country or allow them into our country while increasing things such as background checks to decrease the amount of the chance of terror threats coming into our country, or to just to limit the entire immigration just for now. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I can hear the question. That's fine. Yep. Thank you very much indeed for the question. And indeed, I was looking at the online discussions that I think various of you took part in, and it was reassuring to see how many kind of people were taking a very humanitarian approach of what's happening in Syria. I think with Syria we have to remember that this is an extraordinarily war-torn country and the conflict is still going on even today. People are dying, and so many millions of people have had to leave their homes or have been killed. Those people could be us. This is something worth remembering. Those people could be us. They are professionals like me. They are young students like you. And in all our thinking about what to do with Syria, we need to keep that in mind, in my view. So then the question is, what exactly do you do? Of course, dealing with that Syrian conflict has been a big preoccupation of President Obama and Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. It's something that the US doesn't control, and there's been all sorts of debates about whether the US should intervene more closely in that war. And my question has always been, well, whose side would you be on to try to stop the war? What would be, if you were to send troops, what would their mission be? And I think that is what has held back the United States from any more decisive move. I just think it's a very complicated war, much more complicated than most wars, perhaps, and very difficult to know the answer. The US, I think the US is doing some sensible things now in terms of targeting ISIS and so forth. But then you're left with the question: so what do you do with the people that are displaced from Syria, who've lost everything? And in the last year, we've seen a huge influx of people in Europe from Syria, people taking the most hair-raising journeys across the Mediterranean in small boats. And in fact, Europe has responded in a very humanitarian way. Most countries have anyway. And especially Germany has taken maybe 1 million new people. That's really a lot of people to absorb all at once. As far as, of course, the United States is much further away. I think I'm not going to say how many people a country like the United States should say. I just believe that we all need to approach it from the fact that these from the point of view that these are desperate people. They're people just like us, and we should respond accordingly. I just don't think that's giving specific answers is helpful in this. I think people have to do, the surges of immigration, of course, we know do cause problems in countries. We can't ignore those problems. They cause cultural problems, they cause political problems, and so on. But nevertheless, we just have to come at it from the right frame of mind. It's about the chap who asked the question in the corner. Do you want to come back on that? Okay. Yeah, I think your mics are turned off at the moment.
I just turned it back on.
Okay.
Please.
How exactly we can be so open about taking immigrants in the country with the very recent event of I don't know the exact number, but there were a number of immigrant criminals that just got lost in the system, and now they're roaming free in the United States. And to go along with that, with the increased number of problems that have happened with the countries that have taken a large number of Syrian immigrants, such as Germany, where the crime rate has shot up, and there's been a number of problems there. I'm just curious.
Of course, as I say, there are going to be problems. I think you raise a very important point. But if one's referring specifically to terrorism, and I don't want to trivialize this because it is very important, but no doubt you saw this argument about Skittles, where Trump tweeted a picture of, or somebody in the Trump family tweeted a picture of a bowl of Skittles. I was watching the Fareed Zakaria program on CNN the other day, and he said that you would have to go through 69 million bowls of Skittles to get to somebody who might cause you some kind of problem. I think that if you're dealing with, that we have law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies that are set up to deal with that. They deal with it anyway. The number of people coming into the United States every day is huge. And they all have to go through security. They all are liable to come under the surveillance of various U.S. agencies, just as they are in other countries. Just as people there are various agencies in the U.K. look at people coming at the U.K. to try to identify risks. You're never going to be able to catch every criminal, every terrorist, but you need to bring to bear the weight of your intelligence agencies and try to keep the problem in proportion. Of the number of people coming into the United States, the number of people who might commit a terrorist act or an act of violence is going to be tiny. One has to think, and just because we see press stories about this or that attack, we can't, or this and that problem in Germany. We can't Germany is a big country. We shouldn't over-exaggerate the problem that kind of thing is causing, and we've had the means to deal with it.
I'm going to take the prerogative of being the moderator and ask my own question, if I may, before getting back to some others. We have some others from chat, but I noticed that in your list of top dangers for U.S. You did not mention China, Alex, and yet China, as you mentioned, is expanding economically very aggressively. It's expanding in other ways in the South and East China Seas. It's been reclaiming land and building facilities there, and in some cases, military facilities on disputed islands. It has imposed an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, and its Navy's been aggressively patrolling the waters of these areas. So my question is, why did you not name China as a threat?
Well, as I said, thanks very much, Nelson. As I said, I was trying to say what I thought were the biggest threats, and it's true, of course, that you're right that China has done and is doing some kind of worrying things. The thing that I would to keep in mind most is the cyber attack problem, where China has been accused, apparently with quite good evidence, of quite extensive cyber attacks on bodies in companies in the United States. And of course, there are these disputes in the South China Sea. And I would agree with you that this is that what China does is very important from a security point of view for the United States, because the United States Navy is so dominant in the Pacific Ocean. But that also provides a very good defense. I mean, I still see China as a rising economic power that's mainly concerned about its own growth, its own development. It does want to be seen as a global power. It also has a strongly nationalist streak that can make it very touchy sometimes. But militarily, they are spending a lot more on defense, the Chinese, but they're not really posing yet any serious military threat to the United States. Of course, the United States needs to remain very vigilant about this, and certainly is, especially given, as I say, its naval dominance of the Pacific, also its close alliances with Japan and South Korea, very close to China. But I just don't think yet. I think right now it's still at the time of being a strategic partner, and the efforts on both sides are to create strategic partnerships. This could change in the future as a result of growing Chinese power, but I'm trying to look at it as things are right now. That was my rationale for not including them.
Fair enough. We have another question on chat. This one comes from Albuquerque Academy. What would or should be the consequences of the response from the U.S. if there were further direct incursions by Russia into Ukraine? As you mentioned in the chat discussions, there's been quite a bit of back and forth on Russia and Ukraine. So what do you think would be the consequences or response from the U.S. if there were any direct incursions by Russia into Ukraine?
Well, I doubt whether the U.S. kind of level of engagement would change that much, given what we've seen so far. Of course, it would depend who was president and what view that president took, and also how serious were the incursions that you mentioned. I mean, there's another thing too. Just today, in the news, we have the outcome of one of the investigations into the plane crash 2 years ago, when a Malaysian airline plane was hit above Ukraine by a missile and 298 people were killed. I've often thought, what would have been the American reaction if that had been an American airliner? Could easily have been, that's going to be an unanswered question, but I would leave it in the air, because if you were to have a renewed outbreak of conflict in Ukraine, and it is kind of, it's become like a sort of simmering or sort of frozen, semi-frozen conflict in Ukraine right now, but it can easily flare up again. What would happen if American interests were directly attacked? That's why, I put Russia up there in my top 4 list of threats, because I do think that there's a potential for the relationship with Russia to deteriorate at some point. It's an unstable element in world affairs right now, and Russia's a very important country, nuclear armed, and so on. So it's whether the US would respond more directly than it has so far would depend very much on the circumstances, I think. But I do think that Russia has already sort of achieved its end in what it's done, in that there's no talk now of Ukraine joining NATO. Seems unlikely to happen in the foreseeable future, just as it intervened in Georgia, another country in that region, in 2008. And Georgia at that time was being sort of touted as a NATO member for the future, and we haven't heard too much about that either. So there's a balance there that Putin is trying to keep, but it's an unstable balance, I would say.
Right. Good. Greenhill, any questions from Addison?
Right now, where do you think the places with the biggest potential conflict, like the U.S., China, Taiwan Strait, India, Pakistan, and somewhere else completely?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think if we're looking beyond the conflicts that we've already mentioned, I do still think that the Afghan-Pakistan situation also remains very, very unstable. And Pakistan is also a country with nuclear weapons, although, of course, those weapons are really intended to deal with India if conflict should break out there. And the India-Pakistan balance is always a very delicate one that has, in the past, flared up quite a lot. Nelson and I both used to live in India in times gone by, so we've seen that at first hand. And there are a lot of areas in the world where conflict should break out, but we also have to look at progress. And I think even today, Colombia is signing an agreement with the left-wing FARC guerrillas that have plagued that country for about the last 50 years. So, there is progress in some parts of the world. There are setbacks in other. This is the challenge of the US president, to try to keep track of all of these things, because the US president is always expected to somehow to deal with everything. Perhaps an unrealistic expectation. There are a number of potential flashpoints in the world. We have to keep an eye on them.
In terms of potential flashpoints, you mentioned Iran earlier, Alex, and last week we had Rami Khouri on News Decoder, and he basically said that the agreement, the nuclear agreement with Iran, was, as far as he was concerned, a tremendous achievement. It showed that the West and Iran could deal with each other on equal terms, and that it did provide for a higher level of security in the region. Is that a viewpoint that you would agree with? And if so, does that remove one of the main threats in the Middle East, leaving the other threats which you've discussed, but at least removing, for the near term, a nuclear threat in the region?
I think it is a very positive development, Nelson. I can see the doubts about it that Donald Trump and others often express. But from my point of view, I actually was in Iran in 1980, which, if you remember, was when the Iranian students took over the U.S. embassy in Tehran and held that embassy for 444 days until President Reagan entered the White House, and they held 52 American hostages for that time. And so that incident, long-standing incident, caused a rift in trust between Washington and Tehran that affected a whole generation of people. And for years, there was just no chance of any improvement in relations between the two. And I think, and this is very much a sort of bilateral argument between two countries. Standoff, if you like. They could just never talk to each other. Now, if that was to occur between two people, you would hope that one day they could start to talk to each other, and this indeed is what has happened. This has happened because, well, developments on both sides. It's because I think President Obama was more open to discussion. In his first inauguration address, he expressed that. Then at the same time, there were sanctions, which put a lot of tightened economic conditions in Tehran. A combination of factors, which and also Iran didn't want to be isolated forever, I think. But there were interests on both sides. Iran wanted to be part of the world community. So I see it more broadly than just what's going to happen with nuclear weapons. I see it as being the beginning of a coming back together, of being able to, not always agreeing, but being able to treat each other as normal countries. And so that, I think, is partly the significance of this agreement. I also think that it will keep the lid on what was a very, what is a potentially worrying nuclear program, and give time for relations to improve more generally.
Thank you, Alex. Back to Addison. Any questions from Greenhill?
Sure. That's good.
Okay. You mentioned gun violence as one of the biggest threats to America.
Yeah.
How do you propose that we could control guns without encroaching on the Second Amendment, or without angering the NRA, or causing people to go for mad dash for guns and stuff? So what's your suggestion for basically gun control?
It's a very thorny problem, I think, because of already you have hundreds, hundreds of millions of, I don't know how many people actually own guns. You've got hundreds of millions of guns in America, so you can't just take them away. And as you mentioned, there is a constitutional bar on doing so. It's something that I, as a non-American, and many of us here in the UK, we can't really understand the situation in the United States, because we don't have guns. The risk of being killed by a gun is almost non-existent in this country. Our policemen don't have guns in the normal run of affairs. They do have weapons training, and supposedly, if there is an incident, weapons-trained officers with weapons can be at any point in the country within a few minutes. But hopefully one doesn't have to discover whether that's true or not. But I think that in order to get, from my point of view, an improvement, one has to start trying to change the mindset. People talk about very specific measures, background checks. People talk about, stopping people who are on the terrorist watch list from buying guns. I mean, you'd think that would be fairly obvious, but even that can't get through Congress. So you have to change the mindset among the people who are going to be taking the eventual decisions. That's to say politicians. One has to persuade them that if you like, the culture surrounding these whole things has to change. The attitudes have to change. I think only then can you get to the necessary laws and regulations that you're going to need, in my view, to limit guns. I mean, it is, from my point of view, quite an extraordinary situation. I can see why it's developed, or I can see partly why it's developed. I can see the very strong political interests that are involved. The NRA is terribly important. The NRA influences a lot of politicians. But as I say, I think the core of it is people's basic attitudes. I mean, it's extraordinary to me, as I mentioned, the level, of course, the level of deaths from gun attacks is very high. So also is the level of suicides and that kind of thing. This is something which we here in Britain, we just can't really understand.
Okay, we have about 5 more minutes, so I think we probably have time for 2 more questions. I'll ask one from the chat room, if I may, and then turn it back to Greenhill for a final question. And we have a number of, we're not going to be able to ask all the questions from chat room, unfortunately, or relay all the comments, but I'll be sure to do so offline when we're finished with Mr. Nicoll. The question that we do have that we will be able to ask relates to the South China Sea. It says, what are your thoughts on the U.S.'s deployment in the South China Sea? Many of the arguments state that U.S. hegemony is going down in Asia and that China isn't upholding the international law with their island building in the South China Sea. Then on the other side, arguments state that if we go into the South China Sea, we will start a nuclear war in Asia because of our allies, such as Japan, will get mad. What's your view then on the U.S. stance towards the South China Sea and China's behavior there, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first point to make, it's a very good question. I think the first point to make is that the U.S. already is in the Pacific and in the South China Sea, and the U.S. is an enormous naval power, its naval presence, and on the other side, we see these activities by China, which are provocative. They're provocative partly to the United States, partly to the other countries which claim the islands that are in the South China Sea. A lot of them aren't even islands, they're just rocks or even undersea kind of formations. But a great deal of kind of nationalist fervor in China has been attached to this. And so what we're seeing is basically kind of sparring, you know, where each country's navy or air force will test each other out. And this we've seen in other parts of the world, for example, between NATO air forces and Soviet bloc air forces during the Cold War. It's fairly normal kind of behavior where you've got an issue between two countries. President Obama has slightly shifted the share of U.S. military assets from Europe to the Pacific, so-called pivot to Asia. But I think, you know, as I said, this is really only marginal because the U.S. already is in Asia very strongly. I think that China's activities are equally disturbing to Japan and South Korea and America's other allies in the region. So I think that, you know, if anything, it's going to strengthen those alliances. That's to say, the US alliances with other Asian partners are going to strengthen because they're all going to be concerned about what China might do in the future.
Right, okay. Thank you. And last question, let's go back to Greenhill in Texas. Give you the last shot here.
I might ask a question, Alex. And first, let me just say thank you on behalf of our students and on behalf of Greenhill School. Thank you so much for your time this morning. This has been terrific.
Pleasure.
And I might ask a question on their behalf. I think there are a lot of students in this room and in this course that are really curious about the world and want to engage with these issues in a really serious way. Obviously, you've made your living professionally reporting on these issues and living in various places around the world. And I'm just wondering what advice you might have for young people who are curious about the world and want to engage in the world in a serious way. What advice would you have for them, either academically, personally, professionally, as they sort of think about their future?
If one's interested in these kinds of issues, that's a very, very good question, Scott, thank you. If one's interested in these kinds of issues, then I think the most important thing is always to establish the facts. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, you can. You can hear me.
Yes.
My screen is frozen. I'll just go on talking.
Okay. We can hear you fine.
Okay, good. Yeah, always establish the facts. I think that's the most important thing, because you hear a lot of sweeping statements from politicians all the time, and one always needs to work out, well, what is it that's actually happened and how important is this? And also, I think, try to understand history a bit. I mean, one of my greatest regret after a lifetime of journalism and similar things is there's never having really been able to put things properly in historical context. And so, and in fact, now I am actually a student again. I'm doing a history degree. So in order to build out that knowledge and help, therefore this helps to put into context the things that one is seeing now. So those are two things: establish the facts and understand the historical context.
Wonderful. Well, that's a good pitch for learning, and I wish you all the best, Alex, in your studies then. And you're speaking to the choir with students from around the world on this broadcast. I want to thank you, Alex, for taking time from your studies and other endeavors to be with us. I want to thank Greenhill for stepping up to the plate and being live on camera and asking so many good questions and being so engaged. I want to thank Jason Cummings, and I want to and Global Online Academy for putting this entire Flex course together. I think it's a great idea. Next week, same time, same place, we have Alan Wheatley, who is a specialist on economics. It's could be a bit of a dire subject, but Alan will make it very, very exciting. And there are a lot of issues. In fact, we've touched on some of them today, trade and some other issues, which he will be very willing to talk about next week. So I want to wish everyone all the best for the rest of the day. Thank you for your participation. As I said earlier, there are some questions and comments on the chat, which we were not able to touch on. I will relay them to Mr. Nicoll. And thank you all again, and wish you all the very best. Cheers.